So, killing UN workers, attacking journalists, bombing women and children, following a policy of deliberate starvation, bombing everything in sight until it's a pile of rubble. This is way beyond the reprisals for 7th of October.
Today I'm delighted to welcome Norman Baker, one of the most unorthodox and fascinating figures in modern British politics. A former MP for Lewes and a key member of the Liberal Democrats, Norman served as the UK's Minister for Transport and later made waves as the Minister of State for Security at the Home Office. He's a man unafraid to tackle thorny issues from public transparency to corporate influence and especially the covert workings of the state. Norman's political career has drawn both high praise and sharp criticism. As Minister for Transport, he championed environmental sustainability, helping to bolster the UK's commitment to green transport initiatives and localism. But perhaps he's best known or most controversial for his investigation into the death of Dr. David Kelly, the weapons expert whose more than mysterious passing raised unsettling questions about government transparency, or let's call it what it was, government lies, during the lead-up to the Iraq War. His 2015 book, The Strange Death of Dr. Kelly, was both praised as a meticulous investigation and criticized by some as conspiracy theory. But one thing is clear. Norman Baker isn't afraid to ask tough questions, questions that make those in power really uncomfortable. Now, in this conversation, we are not just looking at Norman's career. We are exploring broader themes of truth, power, and accountability, issues that feel more urgent today than ever. For instance, you might have seen a recent clip I made that's been making the rounds on social media. In it, I discussed the shocking media misrepresentation of the football riots in Amsterdam last November, where Israeli football fans reportedly begged by Mossad agents and IDF soldiers rampaged through the city. Yet the global media completely flipped the story on its head. We saw headlines like Israeli football fans attacked in Amsterdam. I think that one was from the BBC. Other outlets called it pogroms in Amsterdam and even Jew hunt in Amsterdam. This led Netanyahu to send rescue planes to exfiltrate the group before the Dutch police had the chance to even talk to them. That clip had sparked quite a discussion on media bias, a topic Norman has strong views on given his own history of challenging dominant narratives. And speaking of intrigue, we also talked about Arnon Milchan, the Israeli super spy turned Hollywood billionaire. In a recent interview with investigative journalist James Bamford, we unpacked Milchan's role in smuggling nuclear triggers for Israel whilst producing some of Hollywood's biggest blockbusters like Pretty Woman and Fight Club. It's the kind of story that really feels straight out of a Le Carré novel, but it's real. And Norman is no stranger to these intersections of politics, espionage and media. I'm curious to hear his thoughts on what these cases reveal about the blurred lines between power and deception. But above all, today is about Norman Baker, the man, the politician, the investigator. His career has been a case study in taking the road less traveled, often at great personal and professional cost. Let's discover what drives him, what he's learned, and what he thinks the future might bring. But I need to warn you, Norman ends with a moving, but not too optimistic message. But before we dive in, I need to say this. Critical voices like the ones you hear on this channel are being actively silenced and suppressed. You may not notice it, you may not know it, you may not even believe it, but it does happen. And I have the statistics to prove it. So if you value sharp, unfiltered analysis that doesn't follow the mainstream narrative, hit that subscribe button. This isn't just about staying informed, it's virtually about keeping these vital conversations alive. Thank you. And here we go. Norman Baker, what a pleasure having you. Thank you so much for joining tonight.
You're very welcome.
Very briefly, for viewers who may not know you, you are or you were a Minister of State at the Home Office in the UK.
Yes.
Yes. And as such, very briefly, in a nutshell, what did you do?
Well, at the Home Office, I was responsible for crime prevention and covering a whole range of issues, most of which were reasonably ghastly, like violence against women and sexual abuse of children, as well as animal experiments and just general law and order matters. I also spent 3.5 years as a minister at the Department for Transport and an 18-year period as a member of Parliament in the UK Parliament.
Okay, so if something as how shall I call it? An event that has happened last week in Amsterdam, if that would have happened in the UK, you would have been responsible for in that period?
Not directly. I mean, clearly there are policing matters. I wasn't the policing minister directly. I was a crime prevention minister, which is kind of one step back to try and prevent crimes from occurring in the first place. So I did, for example, as part of my role, visit the Jewish community in London, and I also visited the Muslim community. So those sorts of anticipatory steps, which are quite important, I would undertake those. But as and when an incident occurred, that wasn't then me.
Maybe a little bit of context. I have reached out to you based on some interviews that I have seen where you were extremely lucid and outspoken in your views. And that puts you in line with the number of other speakers that I had on this channel. And as such, I'm asking you now, I know from a short previous discussion that we had, you are aware of the events that happened in Amsterdam. So what's your general view on those events?
Well, I mean, there was clearly an upsurge in violence and distaste, if you like, against Jewish communities around the Western world. And that's highly regrettable. The number of incidents against Jewish communities in London and UK has increased since the Israeli government has behaved as it has in the West Bank, in Gaza and elsewhere. I think the interesting question for somebody to do a university thesis on, not me, is to establish to what extent the actions of people who abuse Jewish communities are driven by pure anti-Jewish feeling, and to what extent they are being engendered and given energy by the actions of the Israeli government. And I think it's a bit of both. I mean, clearly there's been illogical anti-Jewish feeling going back centuries across the world. I've never quite understood that, but it has existed. And of course, it reached its, I would say, apex, nadir perhaps is a better word, during the Nazi time in Germany in the 1930s, which everybody knows about. And there was a horrific incident and episode in the world history. But I think beyond that, there is a feeling, particularly among Arab populations, that the Israeli government is behaving in a quite outrageous manner, and people are unable to deal with that in a democratic way. Israel pays no attention to what countries say if it doesn't like what it hears. It pays no attention to United Nations resolutions. There were by 2013, and the Israeli government was more moderate in those days, but by 2013, there have been 45 resolutions passed by the United Nations Human Rights Council condemning Israel. The United Nations General Assembly in September 2024 passed a motion overwhelmingly, 124 countries in favour and just 14 against, calling for an end without delay to the unlawful presence in the occupied Palestinian territories, and called for that to occur within 12 months. You know, the resolutions upon resolution. So you can understand how people feel powerless if Israel continues to use extraordinary military force, extraordinary diplomatic force, and pays no attention to the views of the world as expressed by United Nations resolutions. And when that happens, people then become, I suppose, desperate and take actions which are in themselves indefensible, but perhaps are desperate way of expressing something which cannot be expressed in another way. And I know that the events of 7th of October fall into that category. I'm not defending those events at all. That was quite dreadful. But if somebody feels completely helpless and unable to achieve any progress in a reasonable democratic manner, then perhaps sometimes they do resort to violence. So, that is the situation. So I think a lot of the violence which is occurring now is not necessarily anti-Jewish, it's anti-Israeli government.
And here we come to the core of the issue, the strategic conflation of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism, as Netanyahu and co promotes it. And there was a landmark court case actually in the UK in February this year against Professor David Miller. I don't know if you're aware about it. He was a professor at the Bristol University and got sacked. He sued, and now a British court has ruled that you cannot conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism.
Well, look, I mean, the Israeli government, the two groups of people have been very keen to say that any attack on the Israeli government is anti-Semitic by definition, which is nonsense, of course. I mean, I attack the British government sometimes, or the American government. It doesn't make me anti-American. So that's a ludicrous proposition. But nevertheless, that's the one which is happily advanced by Netanyahu and his cohorts, his gang, in order to shut down criticism of the Israeli government. That's what they do. Quite effective. And people are accused of being anti-Semitic in order to stop them to criticising the Israeli government. The other people who conflate the issue are, I'm afraid, some of the extreme Palestinian groups who don't want to see the end of Israel as a state. And that's equally unhelpful because Israel, in my view, has a right to exist as a state. So those two extreme groups, Netanyahu's lot, and some extreme Palestinian groups and the Iranians, for example, are very happy to conflate those things. Anybody else can look at this logically and say they are two separate issues. And indeed, Netanyahu has to ask himself why it is that in the UK and the US, there are many Jewish people who are protesting against his government. They presumably are not anti-Jewish.
That's exactly true. If you would think this thought through, then all those people demonstrating against Netanyahu, they would be anti-Semitists.
Yeah, it's a ludicrous proposition, but it's a very effective one, and it shuts down criticism. And we can go into this perhaps in some detail how the Israeli government actually smothers criticism. First of all, it hides behind the skirts of the Americans, and it has done so for a very long time, and it's unable to ignore UN resolutions because it's got the American back looking after it. And of course, the Americans have provided an enormous amount, billions of dollars of military aid has gone to Israel, which makes the kind of odd drone and rocket from Hezbollah look pathetic, to be perfectly frank with you. The disproportionate power the Israeli government has in military terms compared to its neighbours is enormous. And that's partly because the Americans are continuing to fund the Israeli government through thick and thin. And I don't actually understand why, except for naked political reasons, the US government, all US governments, do that. I know the Israelis are very keen, Israeli governments are very keen to make sure that those who are elected to Congress are either neutral or pro-Israeli. And they spend an enormous amount of time and money trying to prevent the election of people who may be critical. So they have a kind of tame Congress, and that necessarily affects the presidency. But there are many Jewish people, and I know them, in fact, some of them in New York and other parts of the United States, who are horrified by what's happening in the Middle East at the moment. But you don't hear those voices. Israel ignores those people. It's got military support from the Americans. And as long as that continues, presumably there's no check on them. And, we have President Biden, rapping Israel over the knuckles, saying you mustn't do this, you mustn't do that. All he succeeded in doing is making himself look weak, because Israelis pay no attention whatsoever to what he says.
I think that has become increasingly clear that America no longer has real control over Israel.
No, it doesn't. And so the question then is, why is it continuing to fund Israel when actually, A, Israel's paying no attention, B, it's actually in a way which is destabilising the Middle East, which is not in America's interest to destabilise the Middle East, and C, when it looks makes the American president and the American democratic system look weak.
If you look at this from a geostrategic perspective, you just said America has no interest in destabilizing the Middle East. But and I think it was Joe Biden who said it already back in 1980s. Israel is an unsinkable aircraft carrier, and if we wouldn't have Israel, we would have to invent it. Yeah? So there's
Well, if we had peace in the Middle East in that theoretical nirvana, which we haven't got anywhere near, if we had that, then maybe America wouldn't need an aircraft carrier in the Middle East in the same way. If tension can be removed, then perhaps the tension on both sides goes and the threats to American interests diminish. There are threats to American interests now from Iranians targeting ships, which of course is wrong because that's neutral shipping. But if Israel was not behaving as it did, would the Iranians target those ships? I don't think they would.
If we briefly looked at the English, also the British involvement, let's say, in the whole saga of the Middle East, starting in the 1980s already, right? So for me as an outsider, completely looking from outside in, what always struck me is the fact that, I mean, Britain must be conscious of its own history and involvement. So it's very hard for an outsider to see why the British are so one-sided. I mean, the Balfour Declaration, yeah, 76 words changed history. So one,
Yes.
one rich guy gave a country that didn't belong to him with 76 words to, it's just mind-boggling. Shouldn't the
Well,
British
look,
a bit more sympathetic with the Palestinians?
I think the British population as a whole is, as a matter of fact, but the government doesn't share that view. It's out of line with the British population. But look, I mean, I cannot sit here and defend the actions of British governments in the past. We made a right mess of the world in all sorts of places, and in particular when it comes to dividing up countries, India and Pakistan, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, Cyprus. I mean, we have a right mess of places across the world as we move out. Perhaps that was going to happen anyway, but I mean, nevertheless, we didn't handle things greatly. If you look at the division of Africa, which we basically carved up with the French 100 years ago, I mean, it's ludicrous. It's not based on tribal loyalties. It's based on kind of two people, one French, one English, sitting in a room with a map and drawing straight lines, with a rectangle or set square, and you get these ludicrous things like that right angle in Egypt. I mean, it makes no sense whatsoever. So, I mean, a lot of the problems, I'm afraid, in the world, and including the Middle East, do come back to Britain and to France in some cases around the world, predominantly, and the other European powers as well, including, dare I say, Holland. If you look at what's happening over in the Far East, but having said that, Britain after 1945 was very, very shell shocked. It had no energy, had no money. It had to rebuild itself. It was in a poor state, and it wanted to get out of empire by and large, and get out as soon as possible. And it didn't really want, I don't think, this mandate, British mandate in the Middle East. It wasn't helpful to Britain to have that. When we're trying to feed people at home and build houses. So, um, so that was not helpful. And the Israelis, of course, behaved in some cases like terrorists in order to try and force the British out back in those days. So why are they one-sided? Because I think if you go back to the formation of Israel, Israel sprung up as a democratic country, at variance with other countries in the region, which were not democratic. It was the only democratic country in the area. That therefore had an affinity with Western countries in the promotion of democracy. It had a philosophy which I think was in its nascent period was perhaps admirable, with the kibbutz and stuff like that, and it looked like it was going to develop into an interesting and progressive country, and indeed for some time it was. And I think that particular perception has helped to found British policy and other countries' policy, even though Israel has now changed, and the Israeli government we have now is really light years away from the Israeli government we had back in the 1960s. Shimon Peres and people were quite different to what we have now. But I don't think the policy of the Western countries has changed to take account of that. And it's not changed partly because of a kind of sentimentality about the past. Partly it's not changed because there's a huge lobby, and I mentioned the lobby in America, getting the people in Congress who are supportive of Israel. Let's remember that we've got Friends of Israel outfits in the Conservative and Labour parties in this country, and it's very difficult to get a handle on exactly how much influence he had, but we have a lot of influence. We've also got treaties with Israel, some of which we know about, some of which we don't, I imagine, in order to promote and foster military cooperation, which may have been sensible and right some time ago, but it's clearly past its sell-by date when Israel behaves the way it does. You've got, I know that the UK secretly developed a defence plan with Israel. These are leaked documents on the declassified UK website, fantastic website. It's codenamed Hezuk, H-E-Z-U-K, designed to counter the, quote, destabilizing regional activity of Iran and Hezbollah, and includes UK and Israeli intelligence collaboration and military cooperation. Well, if we're interested in trying to stop destabilizing in the Middle East, what about stopping Israel destabilizing the Middle East? Because that's the country which is doing most of it at the moment. We don't seem to worry about that too much. Then you've got also the fact that we've been advising, apparently, the Israeli military on psychological techniques, which we're quite good at, if good's the right word. In the UK, certainly proficient at it, and we're now teaching the Israelis about that. The British Army's 77th Brigade, which uses psychological operations and social media, is now we're giving our secrets apparently to the Israelis. And we've also got, of course, a secret campaign went on to influence the British government, pressure from Israel to make sure we didn't have trade bans on Israel. And of course, although the government's never going to do that, increasingly local authorities were taking steps to try and say we don't want to buy any Israeli goods. And why shouldn't they? The democratic outlets, if they want to decide that, that's up to them. And after all, it did kind of work with apartheid in South Africa. So, we need to not have this secret control exercised by Israeli lobbying behind the scenes, leading to a centralised UK government dictating to democratic local authorities what they can and cannot do with their own money.
I think one example of Israeli influence in the UK is the case of Anthony Corbyn.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Sorry, Jeremy Corbyn, yes.
Well, I mean, Jeremy Corbyn is not his best asset. He's not his own best asset, to be perfectly frank with you. He's a genuine politician. But I mean, he hasn't always handled himself in a way which has helped his own case. And, attending kind of funerals of people who are widely regarded as terrorists is not a very sensible political move. But he is genuine, I think, in his beliefs. And he has now been ostracised and expelled from his own party. A former leader, a very recent leader of the Labour Party, being expelled because of his views on the Middle East. Now, that is an extraordinary situation, but it also demonstrates the intolerance of the Labour Party now, as run by Keir Starmer, and the depth to which Israel is able to influence the Labour Party. The Labour Party was very badly damaged as a consequence of allegations of anti-Semitism, largely driven by the right-wing press, and helped, I'm afraid, by Jeremy Corbyn himself. And Keir Starmer has swung the pendulum back now, the opposite direction, a very long way, to the extent that it's now quite difficult for the Labour members of Parliament to criticise Israel at all. And you'll know him, of course, when Israel began this operation, these military operations after 7th of October. Keir Starmer was asked on the radio, I think it was, whether that gave the Israelis a right to withhold water and food. And he said, yes, it did. He's resolved from that now and changed his mind. But that caused outrage, not just in the Labour Party, but in the country at large. Let's just concentrate on what's actually happened in the Middle East. There are 45,000 people who have died. 45,000 Palestinians have died.
As far as we know,
Gaza.
it might be much more.
Well, 45,000 is a military figure. You've also got, according to the UN, and you've got 10,000 people who are missing under rubble, so you can add those 10,000 on as well. You've then got, according to the UN, and this is a figure I've not seen given publicity, very specific figure, 62,413 people are supposed to have died of starvation as a consequence of the Israeli action. 62,000 people died of starvation. Why? Because Israel had deliberately used the withholding of food aid to try and starve the population. They are using starvation as a weapon of war. That is absolutely disgusting. Absolutely disgusting, and they should be held to account for it. That's a war crime. They are committing war crimes.
There are a number of guests I spoke to, mostly academics, who go in the terminology already direction genocide, although I know it's very thin ice, because the moment you use this label, you come into semantics. But you're absolutely right. Israelis openly promote and show acts of war crimes. I think that is true. And in that respect, they strangely remind me on the Germans. The Germans in the Second World War, Nazi Germany, they were so convinced that they win that they recorded everything. And the Israelis, knowingly or unknowingly, right now are doing exactly the same.
Yes. You would have hoped, wouldn't you, that after the horrific situation that Jewish people faced in the 1930s, the Israeli government, of all people, would understand the consequence of what they're doing. And it's quite horrific that they don't. But I mean, it's not just the people who are being starved. I mean, good God, that's bad enough. And all the children and women being killed, innocent people being killed in Gaza. It's also the UN people being shot at. The deaths.
233 dead UN personnel,
Yes.
233. And that number is already a week old. It could already be more.
And 120 academics who've died
Not to
as
mention
well.
176 journalists, right?
Yeah,
Press,
I mean,
big,
it's just
yeah.
horrific. And, you know, I think these are deliberate policies. Of course, Israel doesn't allow independent journalists into Gaza unless they are patsies and guided around by the Israeli IDF. So when Hamas comes up with a figure and says how many people have died, the Israelis say, oh, that's wrong. But they won't let anyone go in and verify it independently. So, you know, killing UN workers, attacking journalists, bombing women and children, following a policy of deliberate starvation, bombing everything in sight until it's a pile of rubble. You know, this is way beyond the reprisals for 7th of October. If you ask what the British people are, I think the British people were horrified by the attacks on 7th of October, and they were prepared to accept, I think, that Israel had the right to go and pursue those particular individuals who were responsible for that particular act of terror, and it was an act of terror. But they didn't. But the Israeli government has taken this as carte blanche to destroy everything in sight, to attack anyone who's Palestinian, anyone who's Arab and happens to be in that area, and not just, of course, in the area of Gaza, but in the West Bank as well, where there's almost 1,000 people being killed since this started in October in that October event. And of course, you've got the settlers on the West Bank now seizing Palestinian territory that's been Palestinian for centuries at gunpoint, forced them off while the IDF stand there with their hands in their pockets doing nothing about it. And because some of these people, some of these extreme people, these settlers, are kind of wedded to the Old Testament or something, believe in Judea and Samaria, and want the kind of Old Testament to come true. I mean, this is mad. And it shows a complete disregard for human rights. And quite clearly, the Israeli government and these extreme settlers are treating and see Palestinians and Arabs as second-class citizens, just in the same way, frankly, as Jewish people were regarded as second-class citizens before the Second World War.
The incident that I mentioned at the very beginning in Amsterdam, to briefly come back to that, was that there was a football game, Ajax against the Spanish team, I believe, and there were a lot of Israel. Again, I'm not a soccer fan, so I don't know who played. I only know Israeli fans were here. They rioted in the city, and all the Western media immediately, a big anti-Semitism and Jews are chased, pogroms, a pogrom in Amsterdam, these kind of headlines.
Yes.
Whilst we know already right now, it's quite clear it was the opposite. Those so-called fans, they were not only fans, they were Mossad personnel, IDF soldiers were with them. They armed themselves. The videos, on social media made here in Amsterdam. They took everything from construction sites, every metal bars, everything. Where I want to go with this is the pogroms that were here announced to have happened in Amsterdam falsely actually happened in the West Bank. If you look at images from the Second World War, where mobs, of whatever soldiers, chase Jews down, this is happening in the West Bank right now.
Yes. Well, of course, and your king has given an apology for what happened to Netanyahu. So
Incredible. Way too early, way too early. Yeah.
well, he has though, but he has. So, and of course, while it was reported that violence was taking place against Jewish people, there was less reporting of the fact that Palestinian flags had been torn down. So, I mean, I'm not equating those two things in the sense that one is a non-violent act, if you like, removing a flag, and attacking a person is a violent act. But nevertheless, what I want to say, I think, is that the event, as I understand it in Amsterdam, like many events of this nature, is not reported in an absolute, abstract, and neutral way. It's reported in a biased way, and we have far more coverage on the mainstream media in the UK, no doubt elsewhere as well, about the deaths of Israelis than we do about deaths of Palestinians.
The media coverage of what happened in Amsterdam was so blatantly biased that both the BBC and Sky News had to pull the video clips that they put on social media. They had to put them down again because it was so obvious that they reported basically the news on its head.
And has the Dutch media acted in the same way?
The Dutch media has acted exactly in the same way. They have a very who told it to me? I think it was U.S. Ambassador Just Freeman. Yeah, he called the Dutch propagandized.
Yeah.
The situation here is not much better than in the rest of Western Europe.
Yeah, I just think that what surprises me in a way or depresses me is the fact that you've got respected people, respected organisations making comments about the situation in the war zones, and they're being ignored. I mean, Oxfam, for example, the British charity Oxfam, which is well established and well respected, has said, quote, Israel has bombed Palestinians to death, maimed them, starved them, is now ridding them of their biggest lifeline of aid, the banning of UNRWA. It's condemnable and another step in this crime. That's a very strong thing for them to say as an organisation like that. But they've said that. The other thing which I thought I wanted to just quote on this podcast is from the Jordanian foreign minister. Jordan, of course, is a very neutral country. It's a very balanced country. It's not in any way associated with terrorism. It runs itself quite well. In some ways, it's quite surprising it's managed to stay out of all this in the last 50 years, but it has, by and large. And this is what the foreign minister said. The Israeli Prime Minister came here today, Jordan, and said that Israel is surrounded by those who want to destroy it. That was at the UN, sorry. I can tell you very unequivocally, all of us are willing to right now guarantee the security of Israel in the context of Israel ending the occupation and allowing for the emergence of an independent Palestinian state. If he does not want the two-state solution, can you ask the Israeli officials what is their end game other than just wars and wars and wars? Well, that's absolutely right. The UN resolutions have continually called for a two-state solution because that has to happen. In fact, if you look back in 1947, that was proposed for the British mandate, a two-state solution, and independent status of Jerusalem. That's what was proposed in 1947. And I think most rational people accept that Israel has a right to exist. Most rational people think there should be a functioning and viable Palestinian state. And most rational people think that that's the way to bring peace to the Middle East. And it's those who refuse to accept that rationality who are responsible today for the carnage we're seeing.
I have returned, incidentally, because you bring up Jordan. Yeah? I have returned from Jordan about 3 weeks ago. I have interviewed 4 top diplomats, one of which was the former foreign minister, Dr. Marwan Mouasha. All 4 Jordanian diplomats shared the same concern with me. First of all, that Israel drives the Palestinians from Gaza and / West Bank into Jordan, number one, and that Israel might even try to extend beyond the borders, which actually do not exist. Most people do not know Israel does not have borders. Yeah? So that's a real concern in Jordan.
Well, what the Israeli government is doing is trying to starve the population of Gaza and force them out in order to create a kind of buffer zone with nobody in it. I mean, that's what they're busy doing at the moment.
Greater Israel. I mean,
yes,
every
absolutely.
soldier IDF also has the Greater Israel here on his uniform, and for anyone to see.
Yes, and the way that people are just moved around and told to go to a safe area, when they get to a safe area, they get bombed. It's just incredible.
Yeah, I think you said something very important. You can make also the living conditions unlivable, that people do not have a choice then to leave. Right?
Yes.
And I think this is what we already see in Gaza. And I think 2 days ago, and I don't have the latest news now, there is a leaked document that shows that there is now a plan for parts of Gaza where the Palestinians will not return. Israel will not allow them to return.
That's right. That's what I understand to be the position. That's an intentional thing. And I think the Israelis are using the consequence of the 7th of October to drive a wider desire for reshaping the Middle East, which they now have the opportunity or the excuse to do. Just in the same way as the 9/11 attacks on America gave Bush the opportunity to go and mess up Iraq.
And here comes Donald Trump the second time. His son-in-law openly and publicly discussed beachfront property value in the Gaza Strip. So what does that say for the future of Palestine in Gaza?
Well, I mean, Donald Trump is a subject of another podcast, except in this context to say that, of course, he was the president who moved the US embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which is a hugely controversial matter.
I would like to run something by you, but you have to give me a minute. Netanyahu, Trump. So Netanyahu currently is involved in 3 corruption bribery scandals, one of which is extremely interesting because there is something beneath. In a nutshell, there is a Hollywood billionaire with the name of Arnon Milchan, today still in America. He is an Israeli super spy, a self-confessed Israeli super spy who was officially hired for one of the most secretive organizations within Israel. And he did this now for 30 years. He confessed this. He gave an interview in Israel in a Hebrew-speaking news channel. Robert De Niro sitting next to him and confirming that he told him this already a long time ago. Yeah. Now, apparently, someone in the State Department picked this up, and Arnon Milchan's 10-year visa was not renewed. As a consequence, Arnon Milchan went to Netanyahu. Netanyahu went 3 times to then Secretary of State John Kerry, and at the end received this 10-year visa reinstated. And then Netanyahu turned around and started to ask for favors, plural, inclusive, I don't know, brilliant necklaces for his wife, but all in all, peanuts. But this is not the story. The story beneath is that the same Arnon Milchan, according to FBI documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act, has been, and probably still is, engaged in espionage against the United States, and more specifically in the stealing of nuclear secrets, also the most sensitive areas of the US, stealing and selling it to Israel. So this is also one example where we can see how deep, what's the right word, infiltration has taken place. Yeah. So Trump is engaged here because there was another little scandal. There was Russiagate, very wide propagated, and there is in reality, and this goes back to James Bamford. He wrote a book about this. He's a very, very respected investigative journalist in the US. He wrote about it. So whilst there's hardly any evidence that Russiagate had any connections with the Trump campaign, there is evidence that Israel has influenced Donald Trump, which goes then back to Donald Trump after the election granting Jerusalem, let's say, the status of the eternal capital of Israel, amongst other things. He also promised to get out of the Iran deal, which he did. Yeah, this is all coming from documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act. So if you know this kind of thing, it's quite puzzling. So I come again back, Trump with his history. I would not be very positive when it comes to being a Palestinian.
No, I wouldn't be either. But the depressing thing about all that and other matters is that they can be found. The truth can be discovered through freedom of information requests or other investigative journalism, because that still occurs. It can be broadcast and published, and people either don't believe it because it's called fake news, or they not interested. And you just look at the election of Donald Trump. I mean, you look at all the things which were against Donald Trump. He was convicted criminal and everything else. It made no difference. And So I think there's kind of the moral compass has moved. People are no longer responding and demanding from their leaders or their governments a kind of morality which you would have done in the past. They're interested in bread and circuses, perhaps, and interested in their own pockets, and that's as far as it goes. It's a very depressing situation.
It's a depressing situation because globally the economic situation, I think it's fair to say it's a crisis. America today pays more back every month on interests on their loans than it spends on their defense budget, knowing that America's defense budget is like higher than the next 9 countries combined.
Yes. Well, I mean, we can wander off on that topic, but I mean, the real crisis, in my view, is climate change, which of course Donald Trump will make rather worse. But so
I agree with you. I agree with you. And what was just the last disaster? There was a
well,
huge
it's
hurricane
disasters
or
in the
something.
States. I mean, some of these neocons, including Trump, denying climate change as kind of tornadoes swirl all around them.
Not only tornadoes. The last crisis we had, like last week in Spain.
Yes, it's terrible.
Unbelievable images, like rivers, like rivers, violent rivers through cities.
Yes,
Yeah, with cars like little corks on the water.
Yeah, there was a well, I'm going to say fantastic, a very moving picture of cars piled up like toys on the street.
Yeah,
Quite
hundreds and
extraordinary
hundreds and
picture.
hundreds. Yeah, I agree with you. And talking of which, the military, of course, is the globally largest polluter. So we spend all this money, not only we waste it on military, but at the same time, the military is also the largest polluter.
Well, there we are. And another big polluter is tech world, actually. All these engines needed to run Google and everything else.
Yes, the big data centers. So I know a thing or two about it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Every dollar you spend for, let's say, hardware costs you $4 for energy. It's that big. Now, coming back to the Middle East. So you were always quite outspoken and advocated humanitarian values and transparency. I think that also made me interested in speaking with you. So under that context, in your long career, and you mentioned it already, 18 years and longer, yeah? So if you look back for you as a person, what was the most significant, how shall I say this? Again, as a person, not as a politician, yeah? What was the most remarkable, memorable, thing that happened during your career? Sorry?
The most remarkable what?
Events, things that happen in a career globally. I mean,
well,
again,
I mean,
not as a politician, as a person.
Well, I mean, I don't think I can necessarily separate the two. I mean, I'm not a politician 1 minute and somebody else the next. I'm just me. So I see things through hopefully human eyes, but also with a political understanding of what's happening, and I can't separate those two things. And if politicians become, someone other than the normal person, then they're not being a good politician. A politician should be grounded in him or herself and in the community they represent. That's what a politician needs to do. But in terms of the events which have been striking, I mean, the obvious one is the Iraq War in 2003. I did a lot of work on that. I'm happy to say I voted against it in Parliament, as did all my Liberal Democrat colleagues. Every single one of us turned up to vote against taking military action. We simply didn't believe what we were told by Tony Blair. And of course, subsequently, it turned out that our concerns were right. There were no weapons of mass destruction. And the whole thing was stitched up by Bush in order to, with Blair tagging on behind, in order to pursue American foreign policy. That's basically what it came down to. And that did a lot of damage to Parliament. It did a lot of damage to politicians, because if the Prime Minister of the day tells you something, and it turns out not about something really serious about war, and it turns out to be a pack of lies, then where does that leave you later on? Because a lot of Labour MPs voted for war on the basis they couldn't believe the Prime Minister would mislead them about something so important. And he did. So that was a very damaging part of democracy, that damaged democracy, and still hasn't recovered from it. I wrote a book at the time called The Strange Death of David Kelly, which was about the UN weapons inspector who was alleged to have committed suicide and didn't, in my view. and I wrote a book about that. Had the biggest ever response of anything I'd ever done in public.
What's the title of this book?
The Strange Death of David Kelly. It's just being, actually, I've just updated it. It's being reissued in about 2 weeks' time. So I wrote about that, and included, of course, a whole lot of material about weapons of mass destruction, or the lack of them, and the attitude of the Blair government, and what it was doing. They were told by the Foreign Secretary who returned from a visit to Washington that that Iraq was posing less of a threat to the UK than North Korea, Iran, and somebody else. But I mean, it was way down the list, and there was no justification for that war against Iraq, and everything was being twisted and spun to justify what wasn't justifiable. And that's a terrible thing to do. That was create a war and lie about it. So, and that damaged not just the Parliament and the whole belief in democracy, which I think is not recovered. It also damaged the BBC, who ended up unfairly getting hammered for this by a so-called independent inquiry, with the person in charge being chosen by the government. And they didn't have to, but they apologised to the government, which they should never have done. And in my view, the BBC has pulled its punches when it comes to these matters ever since. So it damaged the BBC. So that was a very, very important sequence of events at that particular time, 2003, which has had lasting and unwelcome consequences for British democracy, for the BBC, but also, of course, for the Middle East. Let's remember that George Bush went over there and declared victory. Well, he declared victory in the sense that Saddam Hussein had been dealt with. But I mean, what a mess they left in Iraq, and it's still not back to normal.
I'm sure you are aware of the almost iconic image from Colin Powell testifying in the UN with this little test tube in his hand and the white powder in. Do you know what was in the test tube?
Well, I imagine there was sherbet lemon or something, probably.
I interviewed Colin Powell's chief of staff, Colonel Larry Wilkerson, and he told me with a smile it was salt.
Yeah, well, there you go. I think sherbet lemon would be nicer, but salt. Yeah. But look, I mean I covered that in my book, actually. That whole episode is in my book. But again, you can write these things. You can have a rarefied audience read it and say, "Thank you very much. We learned something from that," and the world just carries on.
Yeah,
you can't stop the river. You can't divert the river.
Yeah, you just brought up the BBC. So from an outsider's perspective, and me speaking with a lot of people also outside of the Western media bubble, it seems obvious. I mean, it seems obvious that the BBC is biased in a number of directions, but especially when we talk about Israel. And again, I mean, the last example here was, of course, here in Amsterdam, where the news was virtually on its head. So what value does this? I mean, me not knowing in the UK is because you said respected institutions. Is the BBC really still a respected institution?
Less than it was, partly from people at my end of the spectrum who've lost confidence in the way they deal with events like the Iraq War, but also because they've been subject to a great deal of hammering from the right-wing press. The right-wing press owned by big people like Rupert Murdoch, who are very keen to damage the BBC because they want to replace it with something else, like Fox TV. So, and the BBC is a kind of bulwark against that sort of thing. So it has been damaged. It's still standing, if you like, but it's been damaged. I mean, there is independent media here. There's Channel 4, which does very well. You get some good documentaries. There is independent journalism. There was a fantastic piece of journalism from the Sunday Times and Channel 4, which was published last week, exposing all the money that King Charles and Prince William have been raking in from people across the country for, charging the NHS to park ambulances and that sort of thing, and charging soldiers to train on Dartmoor when they're fighting a king country. So investigative journalism does take place still. And actually the BBC World Service, which is slightly immune from some of the damage the BBC's had, does in fact still, I think, a very good job. Is the BBC, you used the word biased. I wouldn't say the BBC was biased. I would say they're frightened to tell the truth sometimes.
I'm conversing with two different BBC journalists who both tell me the same. If they virtually said almost the same. If they would report the truth, they would get fired. Simple as that.
Yes.
In respect to Israel and Gaza. So I don't want to generalize, yeah. But in respect to Israel and Gaza, they both told me almost with the same words, if they would tell the truth, they would get fired
Well,
immediately.
I think that's consistent with what I've said, in the sense that the BBC as a whole is frightened to report the truth. And that permeates down to individual journalists. Whether they be fired or not, they're more likely to be moved on to something else, dealing with cookery programs or something, rather than be fired. But I mean, there is an institutional wariness of telling the truth about Israel and Gaza, which is partly because the government doesn't tell the truth. The opposition parties are not as effective as they should be in challenging them, particularly the Conservative Party, which is basically in hock to the Israeli government just as much as the Labour government is. Lib Dems a bit better, but not a huge amount better. And because the papers themselves there's no strand of journalism outside, declassified or a bit in the Guardian and something else, which actually is prepared to take these issues on. So, you're asking the BBC really to go out on a limb and to report the truth when nobody else is doing it, in the face of opposition from elected politicians of the two main parties. So, you can understand in a way why they don't do it. Ultimately, the government controls the license fee for the BBC, and it can decide to privatise the BBC. The Conservatives threaten to do so. So the BBC, although it has editorial independence on a day-to-day basis, it has to go out to government every 5 years for a settlement. And, governments have got long memories.
Some people also have long memories or short memories. But if we talk about organizations like the BBC and iconic stories, unfortunately, I have to say, like the 40 beheaded babies, which we today know from Israeli sources was absolutely not true, but stories which have been repeated then even by President Joe Biden, later even the White House had to pedal back. But these stories would damage any organization, the credibility of any organization.
Well, I mean, yes, it does. But I mean, I suppose I'm not a journalist, but I suppose if you're in the BBC or any media outlet, if you're being told that by some suspect source, you want to verify it. If you're being told by the Israeli government that source, then you may not report it, or you may make it very plain that the Israelis are claiming that, but there's no evidence for it. It becomes more difficult. I think if the President of the United States or the Prime Minister comes out and says that, because in a sense you take them at their word. They are not Israelis, and therefore they've made an assessment. You don't know what's gone behind it in terms of security information and so on. It's led to that conclusion. So it's quite difficult, I think, for a media organisation to try and refute something which has been said not by an interested party, but by somebody else who's in a position who should be telling the truth.
As far as you can tell, yeah.
Yeah.
Was the story believed? I mean, I take this as an example. We could take other examples, yeah. But was the story believed? I know it was believed by large parts of the population, but on government level, was the story believed?
I don't know.
The UK has an intelligence service. I mean, they themselves must pretty good know what's really going on.
Well, I mean, they probably do know what's going on, and it probably wasn't believed. But people who repeated it either did so in good faith, or they did so because they had a reason for doing so, because they wanted to support the Israelis.
If you now briefly switch over to the Middle East again, and in connection with, how shall I say this, the waning power or the waning influence of the US in the Middle East, does this offer an opportunity or a challenge?
An opportunity for whom?
That's the question.
Well, I mean,
for Iran, for Russia, for China?
Oh, I see what you mean. Well, I mean, we're seeing Saudi Arabia increasingly becoming distant from the US, actually.
Yeah.
And cozying up to Russia rather more, which the Americans ought to be worried about, but they don't seem to be that worried about it. So, alliances and allegiances do change over the years. Russia and China are both keen to challenge the West, if you call it the West, and to exercise influence in a wider range of countries for their own interest, of course. Russia in order to make sure that they're not isolated. I think politically that's why they're doing it. China, because it wants to sign up to a kind of new world order where they control natural resources in the way that the British and the French would have done in the 19th century. So that's the motivation. So I think if China or Russia sees an opportunity to do something which will destabilize the West, then they will do it. Now that would be the immediate reason for doing so. I mean, nobody would sensibly get involved in the Middle East, both feet in, because you get stuck. But I think if they can on the margins destabilize the West, and they will do so. I mean, the basic problem is that Israel's out of control. It's a pariah state. It's out of control, and the West needs to accept that. The West needs to accept it's out of control. And in my view, were I in a position to do something about it, which I'm not, you'd be corralling people like the Jordanians and the Egyptians, who are respected in the area and have some influence with the Arab population, to try and come up with something which presents a united face to the world in a way that they don't necessarily do at the moment, and to try to exercise influence that way, and then bolster that with support from the West to try to contain Israel in that sense. And I think that sort of approach needs to be taken. But at the moment, it's all one-way traffic. It's one-way traffic supporting the Israeli government, no matter what they do. I mean, at what point? There's an article, one of the papers in the UK actually, in the Guardian, which was written by Owen Jones. I've got it somewhere here, and he says the headline of the article is, "What atrocity would Israel have to commit for our leaders to break their silence?" That's a very good question. At what point do we say enough's enough? Because my view is we should have said that a long time ago.
I think you're absolutely right. There is complicity on the Arab side too. Absolutely.
Yes, I'm afraid there is.
Yeah. And the way out, I mean, I'm not entirely sure Jordan and Egypt would be strong enough to, I mean, the driving force behind this war is still America.
Yes.
Yes, Israel is out of control, but for whatever undefinable, well, I do understand the geostrategic reasons behind it. That America still sends, I don't know, 1,000 pound, 2,000 pound, whatever bombs, support. What is it? 5 billion, yeah, to Israel. I mean, no other country gets as much money from the US as Israel.
$22.76 billion in military aid to Israel.
In which time frame?
I didn't write that down.
Okay. No.
But I think
it's a staggering amount,
figure.
I try to give people an image how much actually is a billion, or was it a trillion? Yeah, something. Let's go for a billion, I believe. If you would get every second $1, I think you have 3,000 years before you have $1 billion, right?
Yes.
So it's not only a lot of zeros. It's really it's a lot. In less than an abstract
in an
sense.
ideal world, the US and the UK, the US is the one that matters really, would have stopped providing military aid to Israel, apart from stuff which is absolutely clearly defensive. They would stop providing, but they don't. They provide hugely powerful missiles and everything else, which can only be used to kill people, who are incapable of defending themselves. That's what's happening at the moment.
So is it? If you talk about the peace process, if you can even have this word still in your mouth, what the West is doing, what America is doing, is it support or is it sabotage?
Well, it's supporting the Israeli government and therefore sabotaging the Middle East peace process. That's what's happening. I just think, look, I mean, there isn't a simple answer to this. The end result is one that everybody agrees with, the two-state solution with some arrangement for Jerusalem. It's a 1947 solution which needs to be reached. I mean, there's no dispute, I think, and most people about getting to that point, but there's a great dispute about how you get there, which is far from easy. And there isn't an obvious route to get there, particularly when the Israeli government is behaving as it does, and particularly when you got countries like Iran calling for Israel to be exterminated. So, that's got to be, those two sides have to be calmed down or eliminated in terms of their views, and something more moderate has to replace it. Now, there are countries around there who are more moderate. I'm not saying they got a huge amount of influence. I'm not saying they're very powerful, but you start from where you are, and it's possible to construct, I think, a collection of countries to try to advance a more moderate approach to the future, and to try to isolate those in either extreme who are reluctant to see that.
Does, as far as you can tell, does the British government still believe in the two-state solution?
Yes, officially. I mean, it abstained in the UN last year when the issue was put, which I think the Americans didn't. So in a sense, we separated ourselves from the Americans on that particular issue. Yes, I think we do believe in a two-state solution, but as to whether we believe in it in terms of making it happen, or whether we believe in it as a kind of abstract concept, I don't know. The British governments, like all governments, ultimately believe in realpolitik as to what happens, and that guides them in terms of their behaviour. You look at what happened with Tibet and China. I mean, we held up for a long time, more than any other country in the world, because we'd been there, saying that Tibet was not part of China. It was illegally occupied in 1959 by the Chinese against UN resolutions, which then followed in 1961-62. And we know Tibet was an independent country because we dealt with it. We signed treaties with Tibet, to which China was no part because China wasn't there. We were there. The British were everywhere in the 19th century and early 20th century. We were there. So we know. And yet now we've accepted it's part of China. Well, it isn't. We should just, I know it's difficult, but I mean, we shouldn't sacrifice the truth. We can't change it, but we shouldn't sacrifice the truth. We should, you've got to hold on to the truth at all costs, even if it's unpopular and it doesn't get you anywhere. You hold on to the truth, because once you sacrifice the truth, you're lost.
On a practical level, you have today today you have 750,000 highly armed settlers in the West Bank. So any politician trying to get them out probably would risk a civil war.
Well, I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, I think that the only people who can control the settlers are the Israeli government, and they've got no intention of doing so.
They have no intention of doing so because all the Western governments are supporting them.
Well, they've got no intention of doing so because they don't have any pressure to do anything else about it. Exactly. And the settlers are carrying out, a surreptitious government policy by other means.
Yeah. Norman, we are on the top of the hour. It went like, in a blink of an eye. I'm really appreciative of your time. My last question, is there any other topic that is close to your mind, and we briefly scratched on climate change, that you would like to add? Well,
I don't know. I mean, I've gone through, maybe for another day. But I mean, what I would say is that I'm going to end on a pessimistic note, I think, I'm afraid. I wish I could end on a positive one, but I can't. Which is that, for most of my life, and I'm 67 now, most of my life, things were getting better. I mean, it wasn't even, but there was a better trend. People were becoming more tolerant of people who were different colour or different sexuality. The role of women was being respected more. Democracy was spreading slowly but effectively throughout the world. The Iron Curtain came down. All those sorts of things. We used to deal on Kyoto to deal with CFCs and all these kind of things. We ended up making Montreal, that was CFCs, and we started doing some stuff to tackle climate change, and it was getting better. Gorbachev, for example, was a breath of fresh air, and how wonderful it was to see a Russian leader or Soviet leader the chances that he took. He got no thanks for it, by the way, but I mean, I admire him for that. I met him once, and so the world was getting a better place until about 2008, maybe 2003 with the Iraq War, until the beginning of the century anyway, and the crash didn't help in 2008. But it's been going backwards or downhill, depending on your metaphor, since then. I think it's really accelerated downhill in the last 10 years. And you look round at the world's leaders, and you look at Biden being a bit hopeless, and Trump being, narcissistic, and the worst possible leader you can imagine, in my view, for the greatest country in the world in terms of power. You look at Putin, ex-KGB, who's replaced Yeltsin and replaced Gorbachev. You look at Xi Jinping, who's unwound some of the steps that were taken by Deng Xiaoping to try and make things a bit better and more open in China. That's all gone backwards. You look at the German government falling to bits. And then you look at people who maybe mean well but aren't very effective. I mean, Keir Starmer, I'm not against Keir Starmer, but if he'd been there 30 years ago, he'd be okay. But I mean, he's out of his depth in the world we're in today. You look at someone like Trudeau in Canada or Macron. I mean, these people are okay, but I mean they're not having any influence, and they don't stand out as leaders. I mean, where's a generation of leaders you can look up to who can take us forward in this hugely difficult and negative world? I don't see them anywhere. I see either evil people, or I see people who are well-meaning but ineffective, and that's what we got in the world today. Let's have, and I'm not in favour of kind of autocratic strong leaders, but let's have some belief in democracy, a belief in the values I grew up with, the human rights values, the transparency, the respect, all those sorts of things which kind of have dissipated, and I don't see them coming back. So that's a very negative way to finish, I'm afraid. And I take some comfort from the fact that my football team's top of the league at the moment. I have to look for something, don't you?
You're absolutely right. On that note, Norman, it was my pleasure talking to you. Yeah.
Thank you for watching. If you found this conversation as thought-provoking as I did, don't stop here. Hit subscribe to stay connected with more unfiltered discussions and critical perspectives you won't find in the mainstream media. And for deeper insights, join me on Substack, where I share analysis through the lens of an academically trained behavior analyst. From uncovering hidden motives to breaking down global events, it's where the real conversation continues. So subscribe now and join me on Substack. Be part of something that really matters. The link is in the description below. Thank you.